Hello everyone, my name is Osama, and in this presentation I will be discussing how Immanuel's Kant's categorical imperative applies to the moral issue of prostitution. More specifically, I will briefly explain Kant's ethical theory and then show how each of the three formulations of the categorical imperative helps us evaluate whether prostitution can be considered morally acceptable. To begin, Kant's ethical theory is known as deontology, which means an ethics based on duty. Unlike theories that focuses on consequences or happiness, Kant believes that an action is morally right or wrong in itself, regardless of the outcome. In other words, even if an action lead to good result, it can still be morally wrong. For Kant, morality must be grounded in reason, not in personal desires, emotions, or benefits. This is an important point to keep in mind when we later apply his theory to prostitution. Based on this idea, Kant argues that morality is governed by one fundamental principle called the categorical imperative. It is called categorical because it applies to everyone in all situations and does not depend on what we personally want or feel. Kant presents this moral law in three different formulations. These are not three separate rules, but rather three different ways of expressing the same underlying moral principle. Now that we understand the basic framework, I will introduce the moral scenario. The issue I am analyzing is prostitution, which I define here as the buying and selling of sexual access to a person's body for money. It is important to clarify that this analysis is not about judging individuals. Instead, the focus is on whether the practice itself as a social and moral arrangement can be justified according to Kant's ethical theory. In Kantian ethics, the next step is to identify the maxim, which is the role or principle behind an action. The maxim I will use for this case is the following. People may buy and sell sexual access to another person's body for money. Now this maxim will now be tested using each of the three formulations of the categorical imperative. The first formulation of the categorical imperative asks whether a maxim could be universalized. In simple terms, Kant asks us to imagine what could happen if everyone followed the same rule. If prostitution were universalized, sexual relationships would increasingly become commercial transactions rather than relationships based on mutual recognition between persons. As a result, people would be valued mainly for their usefulness, not for their dignity or rational beings. A rational person could not will to live in such a world. Therefore, prostitution fails the first formulation because the maxim cannot be willed as a universal law. The second formulation focuses on human dignity. It states that we must always treat humanity in ourselves and in others as an end in itself, and never merely as a means. To treat someone merely as a means, it is to treat them like a tool or object that exists only to serve our purposes rather than respecting them as a rational person. When we apply this formulation to prostitution, a problem becomes very clear. In a prostitution, one person's body is used to satisfy desire, while the other person is often reduced to a source of income. Even when both parties consent, the structure of the interaction risks turning people into objects of exchange. According to Kant, human dignity is unconditional and cannot be bought or sold because prostitution treats persons primarily as means rather than as ends. It violates the second formulation of the categorical imperative. At this point, it is also important to mention that Kant believes we have moral duties to ourselves, not just to others. Treating one's own body as a commodity can undermine self-respect and rational autonomy. From a Kantian perspective, allowing oneself to be used merely as a means is morally problematic, even if it is done voluntarily or out of necessity. This reinforces Kant's objection to prostitution from another angle. The third formulation introduces the idea of a kingdom of ends. This is a moral community made up of rational equals who collectively create and accept moral laws. In such a society, laws must respect everyone's dignity equally. A society that permits prostitution treats human bodies as market goods, placing economic value above moral worth. Rational equals would not agree to laws that allow people to be treated as objects for profit. Therefore, prostitution fails again, the third formulation as well. To conclude, prostitution fails all three formulations of Kant's categorical imperative. It cannot be universalized without contradiction. It treats persons as means rather than ends, and it cannot be justified within a rational moral community. While preference-based rules like the Golden Rule rely on individual desires, Kant's deontological approach offers a clearer and more stable moral framework grounded in reason, duty, and human dignity. Here is the references I used. Thank you for listening.